there, and welcome back to Don't Open That Door. It is Justin, Nico, and Dan back at you again, and we have a special surprise for you. We're digging into a book where we've got a haunted detective drawn into a missing persons case that turns out to be much more an evil town, a spooky feeling. That's right. Today we're talking about A Town of Night, the book and the audiobook, and we're joined by John William Worth, the author, and Dean Bradley, the narrator of the audiobook. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great. Happy to be here.
Pretty good. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, nothing to it but to do it. Dan, go ahead and dive into it.
Well, this book takes place in the town of Nocturne, and I know that a couple other of your books here also happen to take place in the town of Nocturne. What was it like to kind of write your own little sort of literary universe and kind of tie these books together? Because as I understand, they're not necessarily direct sequels, but they do have some relation to each other.
They do. It actually didn't start as a series or a trilogy. Originally it started with just Nocturne Hall being like a one-off book, because I got the initial ideas for a hospital being brought down to hell in like 2009. Like the first images in my head and the first ideas. And that's all it ever was, just vague ideas. And then I wrote it. And even though the town of Nocturne only appears in the first 20 or 25 pages of the book, I was like, something's intriguing about that. Like something just attracted me to that town, like the atmosphere. I don't even really know what. So I was like, okay, I've always wanted to write like a Lovecraft story. I like Lovecraft. I like his style, what he created with the whole cosmic horror element. So that's where A Town of Night came from. And then I said, okay, maybe I'll make a series out of it. But then I kind of realized that I liked the element of the unknown. It's never fully explained. It's never laid out like boom, 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 boom. So I said, okay, I'm going to limit it to a trilogy. And that's where A Town of Night kind of became the middle child in that. So really, that's where the idea came from, just wanting to explore elements of horror, elements of this town, and kind of just see what I could do with it, see what the history of the town became as I wrote it.
Yeah, I can definitely see some cosmic horror and Lovecraftian influence in it for sure. Absolutely. And I know in your book, in The Town of Night, there is a book that personally I found really interesting and intriguing. And I'm trying to kind of avoid some spoilers here. So I'm kind of dancing around the subject a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's Tuck Everlasting.
Yes, the Forbidden Tome.
Damn it. Within sort of this book, in the book, if you will, does this book happen to appear in other novels in Nocturne history or anything, or is there some sort of tie-in there at all?
So it does appear. It appears in the next book, which I plan on
which is as yet unreleased.
Yes. So I will say it does appear. Originally, when I was writing it, again, going along with the whole Lovecraft idea, it's modeled after the Necronomicon, which the same thing, at least like at A Town of Night, the same thing happens in Lovecraft. You never really find out what's in it. All you know is like this really dreaded, powerful thing with like dark magic and forbidden knowledge. And that's about as far as it goes.
But it wreaks havoc regardless.
Oh, yes.
For sure.
I wanted to plant it as like a central thing within the horror of the town. But again, going with the whole, the unknown is the scariest thing of all idea, I wanted it to be just kind of like this unknown element just floating there, this dreaded idol, if you will.
Yeah, I thought it was a good amount of like keeping it mysterious, but also seeing that it's important and planting the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Or that's why I kind of assumed and hoped that it may appear in another book as well.
Yes, it does. So without spoiling, I think there is a little more explanation given, but it's still, there will be surprises.
Tease them a little.
Oh, yes.
And to talk about one person who kind of maybe falls victim to some of these surprises, I want to talk a little bit about Matthew, the detective from the book. And where'd you get your inspiration from, or how do you create a character like Matthew? He's got a lot of things weighing on him, especially when you start, you obviously get kind of one side of him. And then as the book progresses, you see more about Matthew, especially from his own point of view and everything else. So how'd you make Matthew?
So he kind of came from, I kind of created him from a cliche. The hard-boiled detective down on his luck in New England is hired to investigate a strange disappearance, a strange occurrence. So he definitely was built off of a stereotype. as a lot of the book kind of was, admittedly. I just like tore it all down to its lowest common denominator and then built up from that, because it created, especially creating Matthew Cunningham, it made something much more organic and much more believable. He wasn't bound by such rigid structure, having to follow tropes and cliches. And while I was creating him, it's like I noticed, especially upon listening to the audiobook, how much I gave his internal monologue front and center.
I think that's my favorite part about the character of Matthew is you get that internal monologue. The book doesn't take place, it's not in first person, but
Right.
at the same time, a lot of the dialogue in the book is what's going on in his head.
Exactly. That's I always give my characters a lot of room to think and a lot of room to breathe. But upon listening to it, I did realize I really liked his train of thoughts. And I liked that it made him three-dimensional in that he's not this outright hero. I remember thinking at some point while I was doing the proofing of the book, it's he's not exactly the best detective either. So
Definitely not.
Kind of not.
so it's I kind of, and all of this, because I did it, this is the only book that I didn't outline and plan out very, very stringently. Usually I come up with an outline with a list of chapters and characters and I plan. This one, it was like a clothesline with a bunch of ideas hanging on it. And I just went from point to point. So yeah, he came about organically. And because of that, he feels like he actually exists in this world. He belongs there. And it was just fun seeing how he grew along with it.
Definitely, definitely. And Dean, I will say I agree with you. I first read the book a while back. Dan had introduced me to Nocturne Hall and this book as well. So I, read it. Okay. And then I listened to the audiobook. And then after I listened to the audiobook, I reread the book again because it is an interesting experience. Kind of, okay, I have the book. I hear that side of Matthew. Then the audiobook, I think, introduces a different side.
Actually,
which
you don't
we'll touch
hear it,
on.
you read it.
Oh,
That's
very
the whole
true, very
thing.
true, very
Yeah.
true.
That's
very
like
true.
Justin, what the fuck?
And then you do that, and then going back to the book afterwards to kind of line the two up. It's definitely an interesting experience. And I guess my last question, as far as the book is concerned, if you could pick kind of one or two emotions that you would say this story exemplifies, what would they be?
And is one of them, oh fuck?
Oh fuck is a very, very big theme running through the book. Let's see, the first is really don't stick your nose where you don't think it should be.
Yeah.
Because he definitely turns over a bunch of rocks that even throughout the book, he's saying you shouldn't do that. And then he does it.
It's like Harry Potter.
Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba.
And then the other thing I would say is one of the things personally a bunch of the characters do is they hide who they really are, how they really feel.
Mhm.
That's one thing. Matthew keeps his alcoholism in. He keeps the problems with his wife inside. So do the citizens in Nocturne. And even Laura, I never so there is a side of her that's never confirmed or denied in the book.
Right.
She keeps that inside. So I don't really give any evaluation on that, but it's I guess keeping yourself secret, choosing what to present to the world and what to keep hidden would be another element.
A lot of the characters, especially the Laura and Matthew, they both tend to have these preconceived notions about other people and how other people view them.
Mhm.
And the two of them kind of break those barriers down for each other and kind of show that there's another side to the world and, people are different and,
Yes.
along those lines.
I definitely picked up on that for sure while I was reading through. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge your Black Swan post over there. That's some absolute king shit.
Thank you.
Just real, recognize real.
I actually got this from the premiere too, so.
Nice. Oh, that's right as shit. I'm jealous, man. That's sick. So without going into spoiler territory too deep, because like I said, you got to tease them a little bit. What's your favorite scene of the book for both of you?
In terms of scenes that were fun to read from the audiobook perspective, the scene in the church with the priest, when he's talking about the priest, because that chapter, for me at least, that went through a number of revisions. John and I had a hard time finding a voice that captured the essence of the character and one time I was just mumbling around and kind of fell into this Irish, Scottish sort of accent. And I sent it to John and was like, oh, what do you think of this? And he was like, oh, yeah, that's it. That's it right there. And I just love the dialogue between them. Again, not getting into spoiler territory, but when you first meet him, you know, you have no idea what this dude is. And then he's the one that actually
Emphasis
kind
on
of
what?
gives, he's the one that gives you like a little bit more of the backstory of Nocturne as a resident of Nocturne who's willing to open up to some of the things that hide under the surface. I love that scene personally.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And my favorite, I would say, it's right at the beginning when Matthew's being stalked through. This is my favorite scene that I wrote and that I loved listening to, when he's being stalked through the streets of Boston after dinner with Penelope. It was great fun to write. I just loved like building the suspense in the scene of him being stalked, and then he sees the thing, and then just like
I'll say, and your writing of the apparition and the visuals you give for the apparition are fantastic.
Yes,
I love it.
It was so much fun doing that. And like even when I read it back, it's like, oh, not to pat myself on the back, but I was like, oh, that was good.
Oh, you should be proud of it. Be proud of it.
Own it, yeah.
All right. And I'm glad, because that was a perfect, kind of transition into talking about the audiobook here. So once again, I'm going to give it to Dan. Take it away,
Almost
bro.
like we planned this.
So how did the idea actually come about for the audiobook, and and how did that kind of whole start?
So years ago, I had actually approached John about doing the audiobook for Nocturne Hall, which is the first book in the series, but chronologically, it's the middle, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep,
yeah. So Town of Night chronologically is the first one, takes place in the early 20th century. And I had recorded a chapter of it, sent it to him, and we liked it, but life happened and it never really got anywhere. And then recently I got to a point where I had a lot more time on my hands, and I decided I wanted to get into voiceover, but I wanted to practice. So I reached out to John over the pandemic. I had read A Town of Night when it came out and really, really enjoyed it. So I reached out to him and was like, hey, like I've got some time, you want to do this? And so we did, and it took a lot longer than it probably should have. But it was a very collaborative process, which is fun. I think a lot of audiobooks nowadays, they post a book that they need to get narrated, people audition for it, the person records it and sends it to them, and it gets published. And for this, we had Google spreadsheets, and, this is what these characters are going to sound like. And we would go back and forth, oh, I like what you said here, but I don't like the way you phrased this. So it was a very collaborative process for the two of us, and it was very much a learning experience for both of us. It was a lot of fun, and John's one of my best friends, and it was a lot of fun to work with him. And the work on the audiobook for Nocturne Hall has begun, and
good.
We're in the editing process of the final book in the trilogy as well.
All right.
So it kind of started off as just, let's have some fun with this, and now it's become very much a collaborative effort for the entire trilogy.
Cool. And this is sort of a question for both of you, and you just kind of touched on it a little bit, Dean, but can you go into a little more depth on like what sort of the collaboration process was, and maybe from both of your perspectives there?
Sure. Most of the time, kind of what it was is I would go through, I'd record a chapter, do some basic editing, and send it off to him, and then he would come back and say, oh, you mispronounced this word, or you left out this line. But a lot of it too was, oh, I'm not sure if I like that voice for this person, and he would send me a YouTube clip of the inspiration or of a voice that he had in his head for these certain characters. And so sometimes I would go for that. And then there were other times where he would text me and go, oh my gosh, I was just listening to this part and I never thought of, this character sounding like that, or this line I expected to be read in a totally different way, but I like what you did more. And he talked to me about how it really kind of opened his eyes to seeing no matter what he's writing, it's going to be interpreted differently by other people.
Certainly.
It's fun to see how different people are interpreting it, and especially, given the medium of an audiobook, you don't have to worry so much about thinking about what a character sounds like. I think you can get a little more engrossed in John's writing when you're listening to it. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, I can say from my side of things, I was thinking of it almost like I was watching a movie, except I was listening. Because I kind of like became engrossed by listening to it, even though I had written the words and I should have known the story backwards and front. It's like it was a completely new experience listening to it read. And like Dean mentioned, it's like hearing characters. I would straight up tell them sometimes, like, I never even thought about this character having a voice. They were like a non-entity. But hearing it just brought it all to a kind of life. And like the scenes that were supposed to be unnerving were actually unnerving. And it was a fun process, I will say that.
And the writing lent itself very well to being read. I mean, it wasn't difficult to make it intense where it needed to be intense. I mean, it just kind of read that way. So yeah, I applauded John's writing the entire way. It's phenomenal. I love it.
Thank you.
I will say that's one thing that I always find interesting, just given. So I'm an English teacher, right? And I read a lot aloud to my students. So one thing that I in particular was curious about, just from the perspective of also having to narrate things a lot. So when you're in the process of making an audiobook, say you're recording a chapter or a section of a chapter, what are like one of the, like maybe one or two most important aspects that you have to keep in mind?
It's a good question. Honestly, what I did for the most part, I had read through the book, and then I honestly didn't do a whole lot of prep work for the chapters when I was getting ready to read them. I would kind of just go through, record it, and read it, and then, I would start editing it, and as I was editing, I'd go, oh, well, that doesn't sound right, or that doesn't flow right, so then I'd go back in the booth and re-record it, but I kind of just I wouldn't say I went into it blind because I knew the story and what was happening, but
fuck, what is this book?
but I kind of just went into it and would just read it, as if I was reading it for the first time. And you have to read a little bit of head just to kind of know,
of course,
where am I going to breathe? Where's the cadence in the sentence? There's always sentences and words where, depending on where you put the emphasis, gives a totally different meaning to what the sentence can mean. And sometimes I nailed it on the head, and sometimes John came back and was like, yeah, that's not what I meant at all.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do with emphasis is teach my kids this sentence. Emphasizing any of these words differently changes the meaning of the sentence completely. I never said I stole your money. I never said I stole your money. I never said I stole your money. So right. I absolutely see what you're getting at there. And sort of like as a follow-up to that, given our nature of this book being things that go bump in the night, how did you approach keeping the tension and just building the fear throughout the narration?
Honestly, I'm not really sure. It wasn't intentional. I knew where the suspenseful parts were, and like I said, John's writing is so organic, and I think part of that may be because of the way he wrote the book. Like he said, he wrote it very organically. There wasn't a whole lot of structure to it, and that lent itself well to narrating it. And I'm an avid reader. I mean, I'm one of those people that tries to read 50 books a year and on Goodreads and all that
Good
stuff.
For you.
And when I'm reading, I have a monologue in my head all the time. I mean, sometimes when you read, you can see my lips move because I'm hearing myself reading it out loud.
I'm the same way.
And so I think a lot of that just translated to when I was narrating the book. I was pretty much just reading it how I would read it in my head.
Nice.
I kind of want to step back for a second to an earlier point you brought up about the voice of the priest and just kind of that. Can you touch a little bit more on sort of the process of coming up with the different voices? I know you spoke about maybe like YouTube videos that John would send you or something, but did you have your own sort of process of coming up with them?
A lot of it was just kind of like just guesswork. I would, like, when I was trying to figure out, the character of Matthew, John definitely guided it a little bit, but you can kind of tell he was the washed up, detective. He likes to drink whiskey. I assumed maybe he was a smoker at some point, and so much of the book is internal monologue. So I had to find a way, to differentiate to the listener when Matthew is speaking and when Matthew is thinking, because there's a lot of scenes in the book where he's talking to someone, and in the middle of his talking, he'll have a thought. And so I kind of figured, going for the deeper kind of internal voice for whatever I'm thinking. And then he just kind of, he had the rough, almost like forward voice for whenever he was talking out loud.
Yeah, brother.
So a lot of it was just like guesswork. And when it came for like the female characters, I don't have a whole lot in my bag for those other than, a slightly higher pitched voice. So at that point, a lot of it comes down to the cadence and rhythms of how you say things. Laura's very much a direct, in your face kind of person. And then you have, nice Mrs. Wilkins, she's the caretaker and she's very calm and she speaks a little more slowly. So a lot of it's just kind of finding, the personality of the characters and then, trying to find a voice that differentiates themselves a little bit. And thankfully, the cast of characters in this book is not massive. I'm not Stephen Fry trying to read Harry Potter with 70 different characters to voice, and every single one of them he's able to do differently. So, but a lot of it was just trying to find a way to differentiate the characters, especially in the midst of conversation.
When you mentioned the word forward of, Matthew's voice in particular, or even just some other characters, I think forward is a very good descriptor because, sometimes the pitch or the tone of your voice doesn't necessarily change, but it is more forward or softer or farther back, and that can help differentiate too.
Yeah, definitely.
So to kind of head towards the end here, given your experience now that you've done this, the audiobook is done, do you have any tips for anyone that might want to do an audiobook, whether it's narration or in the planning process? What have you learned, whether it was a stumble along the way or something else you've done that's like, hey, don't go about things this way, go about things this way, or any tips or helpful advice you might have?
Well, I think one of the things I learned more than anything else is not to over edit it. A lot of the reason it took so long for me, the narration itself, I mean, it took some time. The first few chapters definitely took a lot longer. And at least for me, I don't know how many other people notice it, but for me, when I hear the first, 3 or 4 chapters and then I listen to the end of the book and I can hear a difference just because I think I got better at it as the book progressed. But I mean, if you want to start, just go for it. You kind of learn as you go. And it's very important to get it right as you're recording it and, not have to edit it afterwards. It's a lot less work.
Fix it in pre.
Exactly. So, I mean, a lot of it too is it's just practice. You kind of learn when you can breathe, when not to breathe. I know, like myself, there are certain mediums of voiceover where it's okay to hear breaths. But when I'm listening to an audiobook, I don't want to hear a breath unless it's if a character's running or terrified. There are some scenes where I left breaths in dialogue, but for the most part, I edited out all of the breaths. But whenever you're reading it, you have to be able to breathe. Then you have to be able to cut the sentences together so that it sounds like one, cohesive sentence that doesn't stop and start, Yeah, I mean, I don't know how helpful all of that is, but just go for it. It was a lot of fun, and the next one will take a lot less time. I hope.
There you go.
Half the length.
And now I have a question, and I'm going to direct the questions to the two of you individually, starting with you, John. So again, I'm going to try my best not to spoil anything, but the ending of this book, was that always the ending? Did you start knowing it was going to end that way, or was it something that developed as you were writing?
I had a vague idea of the ending. Like certain elements of it were there from the beginning. Certain parts of it were in my mind from the beginning, but how it all came together wasn't. How the characters got there was kind of like left up in the air. And then when they happened to end up there, it's like, okay, I think of it like puzzle pieces, and they all just started falling into place as the ending progressed.
You knew where the characters started, you knew where they were going to end, but you didn't have the narrative to how they got there, and that kind of came about as you wrote.
Yes. And yeah, so parts of the ending were always in my mind, other parts were not, and it all just, I'm happy that it all worked well together, that it all came together.
And Dean, shifting to you now, I will say as a reader, when we get to the scene that involves the book that Dan was talking about earlier,
yeah.
I was like, oh shit, I have a thought in my head, and I don't know what's gonna happen now. So take us back to your initial read through when you got to that end and you found out the fate of our characters, particularly Matthew. What was your gut reaction?
Again, not to get too spoiler or anything, but I think that's part of the reason I like the book so much, is because it doesn't really end how you would expect it would, but it's still intense. It's still fun. There's still
Right.
fire and people screaming, and it's interesting though. Whenever people have been asking me about the book, like, "Ooh, I hear you did an audiobook. Oh, but it's horror." Like, "Oh, I don't want to listen to horror," or they're worried about gore. I said, "Well, there are a couple gory sections, especially one in the hotel room is particularly graphic.
Yes.
That one really freaked me the fuck out the first time I read it. Yeah. The ending was great, but I think that part, and then the part where when they're walking through the different levels of the hospital and seeing the patients, that one I thought was also very vividly terrifying. Yeah, and those were a lot of fun to read. I kind of when you asked the question earlier about my favorite scene, I hadn't thought about the scene where they're traveling through the hospital, and I think I can speak for John as well. I think that's one of our collective favorite scenes and readings of the book.
Nice.
Yep, you narrated it well and everything. Yeah.
Well, we'd like to thank you both for your time, but before we leave really quick, first off, where can listeners get the book and the audiobook? Where can they get that?
So for the audiobook, it's available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes. And it's available on paperback and Kindle through Amazon as well. You just search for A Town of Night, John William Worth. It's there. You could also check out my other novels, Nocturne Hall, and my first one, The Boy Unstuck in Time.
Yep. And again, if you want to listen to A Town of Night, but you're worried that, it's technically the second book in the series and you should start with Nocturne Hall, you can start reading Nocturne Hall if you want, or if you want to wait for the audiobook of Nocturne Hall, that's fine. But you don't have to read one for the other. They're not sequential. There are little Easter eggs in each, but
They're not.
Regardless of what order you'll read them in, you'll still pick up on the Easter eggs and the little things that tie them together. But the stories themselves are not related.
That pretty much wraps up things on our end. Is there anything you'd like to tell our listeners or anything you'd like to let the people know?
If you like what you hear, you're interested, you can feel free to follow us both. Instagram, I'm Dean Studios _VO. I'm on Facebook as Dean Bradley. John is on both platforms under his author's name, John William Worth.
Yeah.
And yeah, feel free to reach out, chat with us. If you do read or listen to the book, please leave a rating and a review. Be honest. We like the feedback. We want to know what people are thinking.
Very much. Yes.
And we want to thank you guys for having us on. This is a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
And dear listeners, of course, we here at DOTD invite you to take a trip to the town of Nocturne. Check out the audiobook. Check out the book as well.
You really shouldn't, actually. But
yeah, maybe stay away from the town.
I don't know if I would go to Nocturne. Yeah.
But if you like what you've heard as well on our end, we're on social media. So let us know as well if you check out the book and everything else like that. We're on Twitter and Instagram at DOTD Horror. We're also on Facebook. Don't open that door. Plus, you can check out everything we've done and other interviews as well on our website. Of course, that's DOTDhorror.com. But till then, keep yourself safe. Maybe don't go to the town of Nocturne. And as always, dear listener, don't open that door. Bye.